To all of you, and welcome to this session on the book of Revelation. We are in session number 30 in the book of Revelation. I'm Pastor Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. And it's a joy to be with you today as we spend time once again in this book of Revelation. It's kind of hard to believe that we have reached our 30th session. We have been doing this for 30 weeks now, which is really surprising and awesome and incredible. And I'm so thankful that you have held on and you've walked with me through this. And we are at chapter 15, which means that we've been spending about 2 weeks a chapter in this book. And we could spend 2 months a chapter if we really wanted to dig deep into all that's going on here in this book. But here we are, chapter 15. It's a joy to be with you. If you're joining with us again, thanks for coming back and continuing to be part of this. If this is your first time with us, then welcome. Welcome to these sessions. I certainly would encourage you, if this is your first time, to go back and check out some of the previous sessions. We have been walking through the book of Revelation from the beginning to, and we will ultimately get to the end. So, and Revelation, like any other book, like any other idea, builds on itself. Now, apocalyptic literature in general, and the book of Revelation particularly, is not a linear story. Okay, we don't go from point A to point B to point C. This has repetition with recapitulation. Repetition or recapitulation with embellishment. Okay, so what we're seeing is it's more of a circular pattern. So the book is a circular pattern building on that circle. So in order to really grasp what's going on, certainly you want to start at the beginning and work your way through. But if this is your first time with us, I would encourage you to stay with us today. You'll be able to follow along and stay in touch and be able to see what's going on. But then I certainly would encourage going back and checking out some of the previous sessions to get a better grasp on what's happening here. I would encourage you to have a Bible in front of you, absolutely. Whenever we study the Bible, we want to have the Bible open to be able to read it. This is a very powerful thing. I'm not one for memorization. I think memorization is good in the short term, but in the long term, we forget it. But certainly, if you know where to find what you're looking for in the Bible, then you are far ahead of many other people. So having a Bible open and seeing what the words say, not only does that do away with any kind of biblical error in interpretation, but it also allows you to learn how to navigate this incredibly complex but incredibly beautiful and wonderful book we call the Bible and the books inside the Bible, including the book of Revelation. Now, Revelation is the last book of the Bible. It's the last book of the New Testament. The Bible being divided up into two sections, the Old Testament, prior to Christ, the revelation of the creation and the Israelites and the kings, and in the New Testament, which begins with the story of Jesus and goes on to what we know as the book of Revelation, the end time. It doesn't matter what translation you use or what paraphrase you use. I use the New Revised Standard Version. That is the version of the Bible that I work with when I teach and when I preach. But you can use whatever version or paraphrase you have in front of you. The King James, the Living Bible, the Message, the Revised Standard Version, whatever Bible you have access to. If you're accessing the Bible online, if you're working through a website or an app, I would certainly encourage BibleGateway.com. I don't have any financial stake in it, but I have found that it is a very navigable website, and it has many translations in many languages. So that's really I have found that to be a very good resource digitally for me to use when I'm working with the Bible. But however you do it, however you're working with it, whatever you're working with, I would encourage you to have a Bible in front of you so that you can follow along word for word. All right, so we just came out of chapter 14 and we saw the 7 angels. Again, remember we talked about angels. Angels are messengers of God, created beings. They're not divine. They are below God. They are created with a specific purpose. They are the go-between between the divine, who's perfect, and human, who cannot go into the presence of the divine because of sin. Nothing sinful can enter into the presence of God. Therefore, in order to get a message from God to people, angels were employed. Angels are also warriors. They're fighters. They're the legion. They're the ones that do the work of God. And we're going to see that and we have seen it, we're going to see it still again. It is the angels who carry out the orders of God. So we just saw the 7 angels. And they came forth bearing wrath, the wrath of God, the wrath being laid forth on the people. Keep in mind now that in God's eyes there are 2 types of people. There are those who believe and those who do not. There are those who are faithful and those who are not. So the angels of wrath that we saw in chapter 13 and 14, they were the ones bringing forth the wrath of God. The wrath being poured out on those who didn't believe, who aren't following the precepts and expectations of God, even if that means unto death. Well, that's what this is all about. I mean, this whole story, this whole salvific event, from the moment that Adam and Eve ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil until the moment of recreation, this has all been about God drawing the people back into a relationship, and not through force. We are not made to believe. We are not made to love. God does not use power or force. God desires us to love and be in relationship. And God gives us many and various ways to experience that. Well, in the end time, it all comes down to the baseline: do this or you're going to get spanked. Now, if you've raised a child or a puppy or a kitten, or anything from infancy or littleness to bigness, first you want to teach them through gentleness and kindness and calmness. But ultimately, there's a point where if they're not going to listen, you raise your voice. It comes down to that: do this or this is going to happen. Well, God throughout the ages has laid forth this grace and this love, gave forth the prophets and the new community and the promised land and the kings, ultimately the Son of God and the church. All of these as a way to draw people into this loving, gracious relationship. Well, at the end time, if you're not in, if the grace isn't going to work, then God's either going to say you're in or you're out. And if I'm going to kick you out, then I'm going to give you one last chance. And that one last chance is going to come through, well, a spanking. And that's a lot of what we're seeing in Revelation. If we really boil it down to it, we're seeing God giving a righteous spanking to those who are not following the way. I know my theological professors at seminary are probably rolling their eyes right now. My Greek professor, she is a very well-renowned Revelation scholar. And Professor Rossing, if you're reading this, I'm sorry, but that's kind of what it looks like. God's just giving a holy righteous spanking for those who aren't following the way. But nonetheless, okay, so we're in chapter 15 now. We're in chapter 15. So we're going to begin in chapter 15. So then I saw another portent in heaven, great and amazing. 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is ended. Okay, so a portent in heaven, a multitude, a number, a massive number. So John, again, what we need to remember, way back in the beginning of this book, John was called up into heaven. John, this would be the younger brother, John, James and John, sons of Zebedee. John, the one whom Jesus loved, the boy disciple. He is in exile on the island of Patmos. And while he's there, he's having this vision. And part of this vision, he's called up into heaven. Now, we're not sure. It's not clear. And it doesn't really matter whether he physically goes up into heaven, whether his whole body is there, or whether he is in some kind of transcendental state where his body is left in a restful place where his spirit is cast off into heaven. I know that sounds really outside of the Christian norm, but it really isn't. One of the things that Western Christianity has done throughout the past 1,000 years or so is eradicated some of the beautiful things that the Old Testament and the New Testament does show. Meditation and rest. But nonetheless, so we don't know for sure, and it doesn't really matter. I'm putting this out there because I want you to know it doesn't really matter. What we do, what we see is John is in God's presence. John is in heaven. John is in the place where God resides. John is not laying on a beach in Patmos and looking up and God peeling open the sky for John to see, John is actually there. Again, physically or just spiritually, we don't know. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how John got there. It doesn't matter the state that John is in. What matters is what John is seeing and interpreting. And we can either believe that what John is interpreting is true or we cannot. And if his presence there is going to be the dictator of whether we believe or not, well, then we have to deal with the presence. I don't think that's an issue. The issue is that John is in heaven and he's seeing this great portent, this massive amount of angels. So there's not just 1 or 2 or 10 or 1,000. There's a myriad upon myriads. Jesus says, do you not think I could have called down myriads of angels to protect me? Myriads are thousands upon thousands upon thousands. God's army is huge. God's army is huge. We don't see it. God hasn't employed it. But God's army is huge. Because God's army has to be huge. So John sees this great portent in heavens. Great and amazing. Great and amazing. John is amazed. He is astounded. He is in awe of what he is seeing. This is the raw power of God. And here's the thing. This is really where a large slice of God is not really talked about since the coming of Christ. Okay? We know God to be generous. We know God to be gentle. We know God to be merciful. But that doesn't make God weak. That doesn't make the forces of evil overwhelming. That just means that there's a portion of God that we don't see. And John is revealing this. Now keep in mind, John is speaking to a Christian community that is oppressed by the Romans. And one of the ways that the Romans keep order is by an overwhelming force. The Roman army, just by its sheer numbers, is overwhelming. The clattering of its horses, the clattering of its swords and its armor, it is meant to elicit fear. Before a battle even begins, it is meant to elicit fear. The noise and the numbers. So any good Christian living in Rome, seeing this overwhelming force occupying their land, would need some kind of reassurance. Look, if I'm going to follow this God, and I'm going to go where this God leads, even if that means I'm going to be put at risk, I need to know that this God has an army bigger than this one. Well, John's getting a glimpse of that. And John can go back and John can speak of this. So there is a portent in heaven. It's great and amazing. Another portent in heaven. Not just one, but another. So John is seeing these massive amounts of God's warriors just waiting for that moment to go to war. And let us be clear, the ultimate battle between good and evil is going to be vicious and violent. This isn't what God wants. This is never what God wanted. But the ultimate battle at the end is going to be vicious, and it's going to be violent, and it's going to be catastrophic. It has to be. Because for good to reign, evil needs to be eradicated. And not just plucked up here, but it needs to be eradicated. Including its leader, whom we know is the devil. So John sees another portent in heaven, great and amazing. And out of that portent comes 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last. For with them the wrath of God is ended. So we have seen throughout Revelation here now, we've gone back around. We've seen this recapitulation, this retelling with embellishment, with change in details. We saw the 7 seals on the scroll. We saw the 7 trumpets. We saw the 7 bowls. Okay? So we keep seeing these different levels of wrath, so as to make very clear, that God's wrath will burn hot. It is very important for the people, for no one to think that God is to be fooled. And then God's not going to care, God's not paying attention, nothing bad's going to happen. No, the ultimate end will come at the tip of God's wrath. God tried grace. God tried law, covenant, promise, grace, and it still wasn't enough. So the last thing God will employ, the last thing God wants to employ is wrath. Wrath is, in a lot of ways, it can be counterproductive. You don't build relationships through fear. Fear will cause someone to acquiesce for a while. They will either no longer be afraid, or they will no longer care about the consequence of fear. So God doesn't walk around using wrath all the time, because after a while, why would anybody want to follow God who's got no temper control? God's wrath is poured forth at the end. And with the end of God's wrath is going to be the end of the option, the opportunity. That's going to be it. The line in the sand is going to be drawn. You're either in or you're out. And once you're out, you're out. There is no coming back in. You know, and that's the thing. We always think of God as being forgiving and redemptive, and God is forgiving and redemptive as long as the line in the sand hasn't been drawn. But at some point, in order for redemption to fully manifest itself, in order for salvation to fully manifest itself, those who have died in Christ need to be risen from the dead, and they're going to be risen from the dead once evil is eradicated. And unless all of those who participate in the ways of evil just suddenly turn to God, which God would desire, evil has to be eradicated through wrath. That's the deal. Okay, so the seven angels, 7 plagues. Again, remember, 7 is complete. 7 is completeness. And I saw, this is chapter 2 now, and I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mixed with fire. And those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Great and amazing are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Lord, who will not fear and glorify your name? For you are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, and for your judgment has been revealed. All right, so John's getting a picture of the throne room now. And this is a very common thing. Think Lincoln Memorial. Okay? Think Lincoln Memorial. Or, for those of you who are living in the Canton area, think McKinley's Memorial. Only it is not designed, it is not fully manifest as it was, but McKinley's Memorial, like Lincoln Memorial, was supposed to have a reflecting pool in front of it. Okay? Couple of different reasons. One, the reflecting pool obviously reflects the image, makes the image look longer, causes someone to step back in awe. The other thing it does is it makes a frontal assault very difficult, because the water's deep and you're trudging an army through water. So for a king with the throne, there's a vacancy in front of the throne. That's what John is seeing here. John is seeing a great reflecting pool, if you will, glass mixed with fire. There's a vacant space in front of the king's throne. So no one can make an onward assault. An army can't march into the throne room of God and come directly at God. They have to come in from the sides, which is a very weakened battle position. This is power. The other aspect is, if you go and you kneel before that king, there's a very thin line Very thin space between the throne, the ramparts of the throne, and the reflecting pool. And that's all the space you got. It's a power thing. It's a control thing. It's a protection thing. And so what we're seeing in God's throne room, now again, for us, maybe in the 21st century, we don't need to think about God that way. But if God is going to rival and exceed the Roman emperor and the emperors of Persia and Babylon and China, then the throne room of God has got to be 1,000 times bigger and 1,000 times more grand than the throne room of the Roman emperor. Remember, there's competition here. There's power competition here. And John is laying out power competition. There is to be no mistake. God is God and God is big, and that is that. So John sees this ornate throne room with this big sea of glass. Okay, this big sea of glass mixed with fire. So this is not something that anybody's going to want to trod. You're not going to want to tread on this. You're not going to want to try to walk on it. You know, who knows, what it is. It could be water. It could be, glass was something that was really, really hard to make. I mean, making glass in the ancient world was really, really difficult. Mixed with fire. The image is just this ground that is impenetrable. And that's the point. So before the throne is impenetrability. So that is another layer of protection. Now, why does God need protection? Why does God need protection? God is, obviously, we have God as immortal, omnipotent, omnipresent. We don't believe that God needs protection. We don't believe that God could be defeated. However, again, if God is being compared to, and if John is trying to paint a picture, for the believer to have trust in God over assimilating to the Roman Empire, then what John sees with God has got to be amazing. It's got to be incredible. It's got to be massive. And that's what John is getting in the throne room of God. The picture John is painting is one that is above all others. Okay? And also, and those who conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. So here's the question. What's the goal? What's the end game? What is the prize? What's the carrot at the end of the stick? If I, as a believer in Rome, turn aside from following the Roman emperor, giving up my life, being martyred and executed for God, what's the prize? Oh, goody, at the end of the day, as they're burning me at the stake or drawing, quartering me or throwing me to the lions, I get to say that I trusted God. A lot of trust that does you, because it looks like you're getting burned up. But those who are standing along the sea of glass with God's harp in their hand. Now, the harp was the purest and the most beautiful form of music at the time. And really, in a lot of ways, I mean, if you think about the harp even today, it is a very pure form of music. No distortion, no... it's beautiful. I love listening to the harp. We're very blessed to have the harp play here every Christmas Eve. Though this year we're not going to due to the pandemic. However, so what is the carrot of not assimilating to the Roman emperor? What is the carrot of giving one's life in the name of God? You get to stand beside the sea in God's throne room with one of God's harps, and you get to be part of the song of Revelation. You get to be the part of the song of renewal. That's worth it. That's worth it. That's worth giving up one's life for. If you're going to give up your life for something, it's got to be good. Well, that's it, because that's good. That's not good. That's very good. That's cat's meow good. That's where you want to be. So John When he goes back to tell this story, when he goes back to tell of what he's seeing, people are going to be filled with grace and hope and joy because they're seeing the promise of God laid out in the world. They're seeing what happens to those who don't assimilate. They're seeing what happens to those who don't acquiesce, but who fall in and support. They're seeing what happens to those who are part of this. That's incredible. That's the promise. That's the promise that they're seeing. So in the midst of this wrath and awful, the believer is getting the curtain pulled back a little bit just to get a peek. Why would you turn away from getting the mark of the beast in order to be able to do the things that you need to do in the Roman Empire? Why would you do that? Because if you do that, you get paradise. You get to be a singer along the sea of glass. That's awesome. That's awesome. That is incredible. And that's what you want to do. Okay. And what are they singing? They're singing the song of Moses. They sing the song of Moses and the servant of God and the song of the Lamb. So here are the two great pillars. Moses, again, this is a connection to the Jews. This is a connection back to the Old Testament. To sing the song of Moses is to say that this is the God of Moses. Moses being the greatest character of the Old Testament. Moses being the conduit of the law and revelation and the Ten Commandments. Moses being the one in the Old Testament who actually gets to see God and the Lamb. So this Jesus is not equal to, is above Moses, of course. But from a historical perspective, why should we listen to this Lamb? Oh, he's singing a song of Moses. Okay, now we need to listen. Now we need to listen. And what's the song? Great and amazing are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. It's a song of praise. So think about it now. Think about it. We already know that the 7 plagues are coming. We've already seen that God has sent the angel with the sickle. Great and amazing are your ways. This doesn't look very great or amazing, quite thank you. Quite frankly, this doesn't look very great or amazing at all. But even the consummation of God's creation, even the wrath poured forth out is great and amazing because it will create something more. God is not just waking up one day and going, I'm having a bad day, so I'm going to wipe out creation. God is sending forth this so that the new creation can come forward. Death and resurrection. Remember I said before, and I've said it a number of times, nothing sinful can come into the presence of God. So how does one become non-sinful? Death and resurrection. The only way to truly eradicate sin is through death. Is to die purely to the mortal self. So death and resurrection is the key. So even the awful, as administered by God, is great and amazing. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Just and true. Not just and true, just and true. So even the wrath that God pours forth from the scroll, even the wrath that God pours forth from the 7 angels with the 7 trumpets, even the wrath that God is going to pour forth with the 7 bowls of the 7 plagues is just and true. God is God. And if this is God's choice, then it's God's choice. And God's choice is just and true. Lord, who will not fear and glorify your name? Now remember, we talked about fear before, not as an but awe and reverence. Who will not have awe and reverence and glorify your name? That's one of the reasons why in the 10 Commandments, one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not use the Lord your God's name in vain. We are given something beautiful when we have the name of God. When we have the name of something or someone, we have a piece of power over it. We have an investment in it. Who will not fear and glorify your name? That's why the name of God is so powerful for us. That's why we don't use it in vain. And I don't mean just using it in a foul language sort of way, but using it at all. I swear to God. No. You don't use God's name in a swear, because if you in an oath, because if you break that oath, then you're holding God accountable to something that God's not accountable to. So we don't use the Lord's name in vain. So when we have this name, those who are faithful are going to have that name in awe and glorify it. For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. Okay, I want to mention here for a minute this idea about worship. So you alone are holy. And if you caught Nicene Creed last week, I talked about the four pillars of the church. And one of the four pillars of the church is that it is holy. Holy means to be set apart, sanctified, elevated. Doesn't make it perfect, but it means it's set apart for a specific task. Okay? So, the church, the building that we're in here, okay? This is holy ground. This ground has been set apart for a specific thing, and that is to gather the community of faith. Okay? To gather the community of faith. It is not like the fairgrounds, and I'm not disparaging the fairgrounds at all. It is not like the fairgrounds, though. It is not meant to be held. Any public group can come in and use it. No. This ground is meant to be holy, set apart. And anything that happens on this ground is meant to be set apart as holy. Now, there are some groups that would come in and they would ask to use the ground, and we would say yes, because we see them as part of our holy mission. And then there are some who would come in and we would say no, because we do not see their base as part of our holy mission. So, holy, for you alone are holy. You, again, this is the song of God. Only you have truly been set apart. So there's God, and then there's everything else. Everything else. Angels, humans, creation, everything. So only God has truly been set apart. So if only God has been truly set apart, then whatever God does, whether we agree with it or not, God is doing it, and it is right and it is just. Because in the totality of existence, in the totality of the universal understanding, we are but a speck. But God is God. God is God. God alone is holy. God alone is set apart, truly set apart. Now, this ground has been set apart as holy, yes. Have there been unholy acts? I haven't been on the ground 24/7 for the past 40 years, so I would imagine that probably. Sinful thoughts, sinful words, sinful actions. Of course, because it's inhabited by sinful people. And though we as a community of faith are set apart in the name of God, we are not perfect. So we are holy, but we are not truly holy because, again, we are sinful. So you alone are holy, truly set apart. So whatever you do, whatever you decide is true and just. That's the psalm. All nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. All right. So for John, and really if I would really press it, true change in the world comes through worshiping God. True change comes from God. We don't change our hardened hearts. God does. We don't amend our ways. God does. Now, maybe God works through relationships. Maybe God works through hard times. Maybe God works through simple poems or sermons or songs. But God doesn't. We don't. We don't change the world. God does. Because this is God's world to change. Now, does God come down and sweepingly change the world with a divine hand? No, that's not how God works. God uses us. God uses the church. God uses believers. But it is God's work in God's world that we are called to do. So the primary thing that we as followers, believers, can do is come before God in worship. Worship is the pinnacle event, not only in the life of the church, but in the life of a believer. To come before God in humility and praise, to receive that forgiveness and that grace, that's how our lives are changed. My life isn't changed by me walking around beating myself because of my sin, any more than my life is changed by me walking around ignoring the fact that I've sinned. My life is changed when I can come before God in humility and trust, pouring forth my sin, receiving that forgiveness, and giving thanks to God for loving me so much. Of the three scenarios, beating myself for my sin, well, that's just going to be exhausting. Ignoring my sin isn't going to change my life. I'm just going to keep on sinning. But knowing that I'm loved beyond my actions, coming before God in worship, in prayer and praise and celebration and thanksgiving, embracing the love that the Maker of heaven and earth has for me, that's what changes me. That's what changes the world. So for John, the primary thing is to bow down before God in worship. Bowing down before God in worship is an indication that God is God and we are not. So to bow down before God in worship is the primary way to change the world, and really, quite frankly, it is still the primary way to change the world today. Coming before God in worship. Now, does that mean it has to be with an organ and pews and hymnals? No. Is that wrong? No. Is that the only way? No. Worship can happen in many and various ways. And I'm a firm believer in that. Worship can happen in a sanctuary. Worship can happen in a park. I've had worship happen in a hospital room. But it is the act of coming before God together with another in community. Worship is a communal event. That's how the world has changed. The world has changed when we worship God. Because one, not only does that mean we're coming before God in humility and grace, but it also, two, it takes our eyes off of ourselves and puts them on where they belong, and that is God. So, all nations will come and will worship before you. All nations will bow down before you. And again, the act of worship, the act of bowing down, is an act of humility and submission. When we come into worship, there's really only a few places where an I statement stands, or a we statement. Worship is about God. And the we statements come in, we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed. So we talk about what we've done. That's usually not good. When we cry out for mercy, we cry out for God's mercy, not our own. When we cry out for grace, we cry out for God's grace and not our own. And we don't come in and say, God, look at me, I was pretty good this week. Never is there a point when we roll into worship and we say, you know what? This whole confession thing, pish posh, I'm going to skip it this week because I was pretty good this week. The moment that you are able to embrace that is the moment that is missed, the totality of what is or isn't good. So for John, the ultimate victory is when all nations come and worship before you. For your judgments have been revealed. After this I looked, and the temple of the tent of witnesses in heaven was opened. And out of the temple came the 7 angels with 7 plagues, robed in pure bright linen, with golden sashes across their chest. Okay. So John sees the temple of the Ten of Witnesses in heaven opened. The temple of the Ten of Witnesses, this is the place where the saints reside. The temple of celebration, the witnesses are the ones who have shared their story and have died sharing their story. And out of the temple comes the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, robed in pure bright linens, with golden sashes across their chest. These are not meant to look like warriors. It is not the angels that are doing this. And this is really important. We cannot pin the plagues on the angels. The angels are the emissaries. The sash across their chest, they are servants. We see them in churches still today. An ordained pastor will wear a sash, will wear stole. Thank you very much. That word just popped right out of my head. A stole around their neck. That is to represent the burden of Christ that they put on in their ordination. A non-ordained, a person who serves at the altar who isn't an ordained pastor, will wear a sash across their chest. A deacon's stole, it's called. It goes over the head and it comes across the chest and hangs down to the side. That is to represent a servant. The angels are servants. They're pure. They have no malice, no evil intentions. They're not up there wringing their hands going, woohoo! I got plague number 4, baby. Yeah. The angels are servants. And they are dressed as so. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. So the angels really don't even have the golden bowls until they come out. One of the 4 living creatures, remember we go back to the beginning of the book of Revelation, the 4 living creatures are around the throne of God. One of the 4 living creatures gives the angels the 7 bowls with the 7 plagues. Gives it to them. And the angel says, and these are given again. And hear what it says. Then one of the 4 living creatures gives the 7 angels 7 bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were ended. Okay, so what we need to be very clear about here, and we're going to get to the 7 plagues here. We're not going to get there today. But what we need to be very clear about here is this is God doing it. God is putting forth the plagues. God is putting forth the wrath. This is all being designed by God. God is not some innocent bystander watching something else happen. God isn't just standing side by side waiting for something to happen. God is doing this. This is God being God. This is God being God. The temple filled with smoke. The smoke represents divinity, represents power. So God has poured forth and set out the wrath that is to come. All right, my friends, we're going to stop here for today. And we're going to see what happens next time. As always, my contact information will come up at the end of the session. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me and let me know. I pray you have a great day, a great rest of the day, whatever it is, whatever you're doing, may God bless it. And we'll see you again next week.